Final Fantasy, a Japanese role-playing game series that features legendary crystals, mythical entities, and magical spells. The franchise began on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987 and was developed by Square, later becoming Square Enix. Each numbered entry in the series features a new cast of characters set in a different world, which has allowed for the series to reinvent itself over the years. One integral role of a series' success is the music that helps the player become immersed in the game's environment. Final Fantasy franchise's sole composer from its 8-bit roots on the NES to the 3D upgrade on the PlayStation 1 was none other than Nobuo Uematsu, a name almost synonymous with the series itself. However, after collaborating with two other composers for the soundtrack for Final Fantasy X, Uematsu formally left the franchise in 2004. Despite his departure, his pen has left a lasting impact on the franchise, and he continues to compose music for Final Fantasy XIV, the live MMORPG originally released in 2013. His significance to video game music is not lost on video game music scholars, who have even compiled a book of essays on his music in the franchise. But with his increasingly minor role to new entries in the franchise, how do new composers succeed his legacy? Do they copy or emulate existing music, or do they take the franchise in another direction? In this video, we will discuss an exceptional case of transition, and how the sole composer of Final Fantasy XIII, Masashi Hamauzu, both broke convention and paid homage to his predecessor, Nobuo Uematsu. My name is Kevin Leroy Grant, and this is Born Anew, Masashi Hamauzu's role in continuing the music of the Final Fantasy franchise. Each numbered title released on a new system in the Final Fantasy franchise is always considered a big deal, and Final Fantasy XIII was no exception. The game was the first game to be released for an HD console, first game to feature a fully scored orchestral soundtrack, and the first game for Nobuo Uematsu to not receive any writing credits. The game was composed entirely by Masashi Hamauzu, who had previously collaborated with Uematsu for the soundtrack for FF10. Hamauzu had also previously written the soundtrack for a spin-off, FF7 Dirge of Cerberus, before working on 13. Series producer Yoshinori Kitase wanted to use a live orchestra for the new game to match the series' scale. He recalls in the liner notes to the FF13 soundtrack, "If we're going to be using orchestral music, maybe we should ask Hamauzu." Unlike Uematsu's rock music background, Hamauzu was previously a music conservatory student before entering the video game industry. Uematsu had also entered the video game industry in the 8-bit era, where sound for games was restricted only to a few channels, usually having only one dedicated channel for a lead melody, another for accompaniment, and another for bass. However, Hamauzu entered the industry at the tail end of the 16-bit era, when these constraints were already starting to lift. These generational differences likely affect the different approaches to composition between the two composers, as Hamauzu's music focuses more on utilizing orchestral color as opposed to being melodically driven. Speaking of Hamauzu's music, let's talk about some of it. Despite what I just said about Hamauzu's music not being as melodically driven, there are a few pervasive melodies throughout the soundtrack. One such being Lightning's theme, the theme of the game's main protagonist, which is used in the primary battle theme, Blinded by Light. Blinded by Light both pays homage and breaks convention to Uematsu's previous battle music. Ross Mitchell describes two categories of rhythms that Uematsu has codified into the battle music over the course of the series. Diatonic rhythms, a term coined by J. Ron which describes a rhythm with an odd number of attacks and a total number of pulses divisible by 4 that is asymmetrical, maximally even, and maximally individuated. And propulsive rhythms, a type of rhythm that bears resemblance but does not wholly fit into Ron's criteria. Listen to these excerpts of battle music by Uematsu and you'll hear these rhythms everywhere. Blinded by Light also begins with one of these patterns, just like previous battle themes in the series. However, this theme quickly sets itself apart in its unique use of orchestral color that recontextualizes Lightning's theme. FF13 is the first game in the series to have a main battle track be based on the theme of the game's main protagonist. The main battle theme, Blinded by Light, was actually the first piece of music that was composed for the game's soundtrack, being revealed in the 2006 E3 trailer. This trailer placed heavy emphasis on Lightning's power and style. Lightning's theme in this context breaks established gender tropes in music, as it does not fall into common feminine or masculine themings heard throughout the series. When the E3 trailer reaches the B section of the melody, footage shifts to concepts of the gameplay, which is more dynamic than the final release. The energy of the music at this section reflects this aim, and highlights Lightning's acrobatic fighting style. The music is therefore showcasing Lightning's power to the audience. Orchestral color in Blinded by Light is highlighted upon the repetition of the melody. The A section features an 8-bar phrase played in the horns that is then repeated with only the final note changing. On the repeat, there is a subtle string countermelody that is added along with an electric guitar that plays the familiar propulsive rhythm as a riff. The B section also contains another repeated 8-bar phrase composed of melodic fragments with a subtle synth countermelody. Throughout Blinded by Light, Hamauzu utilizes orchestral color in a way that Uematsu was more limited in achieving due to the limitations of onboard synthesizers on previous consoles. The rhythm and melody of Uematsu's early battle music was born out of dealing with limited channels for sound. However, the addition of live orchestral instruments allows newer composers to use the color of real instruments as salient material. Hamauzu's set of final boss tracks also reflect both a familiar and a unique approach to final boss music. Born Anew follows in the Latin choir trope that would be familiar to Final Fantasy players, with Uematsu's one-winged angel for Final Fantasy VII. However, much like the simple set of melodic patterns in Blinded by Light, Born Anew has two sets of melodic patterns that repeat in their respective sections. With each repetition of a melodic text, the orchestra gets scored differently. The refrain in the A section is first played at a loud dynamic level, and then is immediately followed by the same refrain but softer. The B section follows the same pattern but in reverse. Throughout both sections, various flourishes and accents are played by the rest of the orchestra. The live vocalists and instruments produce intense vibrato and evoke excerpts of Carl Orff's Carmina Burana. In both tracks, Hamauzu adopts more of a classical approach than Uematsu, who opted for more of a rock orchestra approach with Dancing Mad and One-Winged Angel. The classical orchestration parallels are more apparent in Nascent Requiem, which prioritizes no one instrumental section over the other. Yoshihisa Hirano is credited as the primary orchestrator for both tracks, so not all of this could be attributed to Hamauzu alone, but he likely had a strong vision for the arrangements. Hamauzu's final boss music plays into previous thematic tropes through its use of the Latin choir, but the dynamic use of orchestral color sets it apart from Uematsu's previous more melodic-based tracks. So what tracks from Hamauzu completely break away from Uematsu's style? In FF13 soundtrack, there are 8 tracks that be considered battle themes. 3 of these tracks, Eidolons, Test of the Sea, and Desperate Struggle, do not use the rhythmic patterns of Uematsu and do not contain much melodic material at all. They all additionally contain a large amount of repetition and small melodic fragments. For the purposes of this video, we will focus on Test of the Sea, which does not feature any long-form melody at all. The most recognizable melody are only comprised of 4 notes. These melodic fragments are highlighted by slowly changing harmonies, syncopated stabs, and a relentless percussion. The orchestration here reflects the game's futuristic setting with a mixture of both synthesized and orchestral sounds. In comparison, Uematsu's Forcing Away from Final Fantasy VIII follows a more consistent melodic contour throughout, and its instrumentation reflects Uematsu's rock music background. Hamauzu's writing style here does not reflect Uematsu's rhythmic or melodic writing at all, presenting a significant departure from Uematsu's battle music. Instead, Hamauzu's music is built on sectional riffs with shifting harmonies. The result is a battle theme that is more atmospheric than melodically driven, which is a common theme throughout this video. In conclusion, Masashi Hamauzu's soundtrack for Final Fantasy XIII broke many conventions for the Final Fantasy franchise, whilst also paying homage to Uematsu's legacy. Hamauzu paid homage through familiar propulsive rhythms in Blinded by Light, and familiar Latin choir tropes used in his final boss music. In his battle music, he established a new direction by focusing more on orchestral color and atmosphere rather than melody. He also broke feminine theming tropes by having the theme of the series' first major female lead for a numbered title be highlighted in the game's main battle theme. By not directly quoting Uematsu throughout the majority of the soundtrack, Hamauzu has also lifted the burden for future composers to always do the same. The game's soundtrack was one of the most well-received aspects about the game, and its reception proves that wholly original music can also be successful. FF13's soundtrack represents a major hurdle that other media franchises have also struggled with in recent decades. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild represents a similar parallel to Final Fantasy, as longtime composer Koji Kondo composed no tracks for that game. Nobuo Uematsu has expressed his concerns for the future for video game music in an interview with Karen Collins.
ゲーム音楽ってねなんか今型にはまりつつあると思うんですよ。やっぱり少なくとも日本のゲーム音楽っていまだにやっぱりハリウッド映画を目指してるような気がする。でもハリウッド映画の音楽を目指しててもゲーム音楽を作ってる作曲家だけじゃなくてディレクターとかプロデューサーもいつまでも映画に
Regardless of these circumstances, video game music for long-running franchises will continue to evolve without the composers of their inaugural titles, both in Japan and globally. Future studies should address these instances to better trace the lineage and trajectory of the field of video game music research. Hamauzu's soundtrack for FF13 showcases that the music of the franchise can reinvent itself, just as the series does with each new installment. Final Fantasy can be born anew. Thank you for watching.